Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan. 12 presidents, and this man has covered them all. Tonight, Richard Strout, known to many as TRB, looks back on 60 years of reporting on presidents and politics. I'm Bill Moyers.
In keeping with Chevron's tradition of service throughout the 20th century, the people of Chevron bring you this program in support of public television.
This is Washington, D.C. in the 1920s. And Richard Strout was 25 years old when he first arrived in the nation's capital to begin his long career in journalism.
1923, I drove down from Boston to Washington in a towering 7-foot Model T, and it took 3 days. That was the car where you measured your gasoline by getting out, lifting the front seat, and sounding the trunk tank with a yardstick. I could park my Model T all day long in the ellipse behind the White House with plenty of room and no parking ticket. It's hard to reconstruct 1923 today. There wasn't any Pentagon. The State War and Navy building beside the White House still held all the State Department and parts of the two other agencies. Harry Truman hadn't put the porch on the back of the White House, and there were sculpture groups in front of the Capitol that you will note in old prints. Columbus discovering America, and a pioneer, or some other figures staying the tomahawk of a ravishing Indian from a settler maiden, which Mark Twain called the delirium tremens style of sculpture. Harding was president, and he had his affairs going on. He was married to the Duchess, he called her. She was 5 or 6 years older than he was. He also was having a little affair with his girlfriend, Nan Britton. I've often thought someday the true story of the White House should be taken the way they do Versailles, you know, the lights, they turn the lights on Versailles and they point them at this window and they say this happened there, and they'd point at this particular coat closet because Nan Britton said in her biography that there in the coat closet, 5 by 6, I and the president exchanged embraces.
No one puts the heartbeat into history like a good witness. And Richard Strout has been a witness to the transformation of Washington, D.C. from an unhurried, uncongested, southern-flavored little town into a world capital. It was only in my own childhood that the 2 revolutions occurred which brought that transformation about. The first was the New Deal. It made Washington the headquarters of a vast federal bureaucracy concerned with promoting the general welfare in every hamlet in the land. And the second was World War II. The United States came out of that with strategic commitments from Tehran to Tokyo, and they had to be managed from Washington. By the time I got there in the 1950s, a summer intern up from college in Texas, the town was a town no more. It was a metropolis at the crossroads of the globe. This growth is one of our century's big stories, and there's another one buried inside it, centered around 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the street address of the White House. The job of its occupants has also grown like Alice in Wonderland after she nibbled the magic mushroom. I'm fascinated at how historians will get at this transformation and reduce it to order, how they'll winnow astronomical piles of films, recordings, and those documents that the copying machines multiply like locusts, how they'll travel the official road to preserving the past. But as a journalist, I'm also specially intrigued by other avenues to the remembrance of yesterdays. The good talk, for example, of keen-eyed people who've been there and seen it firsthand. From their anecdotes come the footnotes to history which illuminate the main passages. Richard Strout's recollections are like that. As correspondent and commentator in Washington for the Christian Science Monitor and the New Republic, from which he is now retired after 40 years of writing his TRB column, he's seen the lions of that city prowl and fight and preen. Most interesting to me, he has recorded the other side of the public image, the human side, both base and noble, which is like the backlight of a formal portrait and often reveals more than the face itself. A walk through the 20th century with Richard Strout is quite a stroll down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Well, this was the capital of my country, and I had been in the Army, and I had all the normal, naive, patriotic, childish thoughts, I suppose, of a young man of 23, and then I was taken to my first presidential press conferences, and there was the White House, which is a symbol of government, and taken into the Oval Office, and there were 60 or 70 men standing around the desk, and there behind the desk was the handsomest man who was ever president since George Washington. He was Warren G. Harding, Gamaliel Harding, and he was wearing +4s. And +4s means knickers. And all my colleagues, I realized that these people must be colleagues. I was a newspaper man too, and yet my heart bled for Harding, and they were asking him sharp, mean, impertinent questions. And I said, how can they treat the President of the United States in this abrupt manner? And he, in his bland, rather noble way, said, gentlemen, be kind to me. I want to go out and play some golf this afternoon. And so after a while, we let him go, and he went away.
Do you remember the little greenhouse on K Street?
Well, there were these hideaway houses, several of them, the K Street house and other houses, and Harding would go in, and they'd play poker there, and he was a good fellow, and he would have a plug of tobacco, and he'd take a chaw, and then he'd agreeably pass it around among his friends if they wanted to use it, and they'd play for high stakes. The National Press Club in those days was not in its building. It was in what is now the Albee building, and at one time a frighted waiter came one evening and rapped on the door. They were playing poker and said, sorry, sir, I hate to intrude, but the President of the United States is outside and he wants to come in, see if he can play cards with you boys. They all got out. Yeah, they welcomed him in. They'd been out traveling with him after the campaign, and they welcomed him. He was lonely. He knew he was inadequate for the job. It was a pathetic thing. It was a tragic thing. It was what we do to our presidents. He was there in the White House, and he knew he was inadequate for the job, and they asked him to make decisions. He didn't know what to do. He broke down and wept on some of his visitors' shoulders, and ultimately he died suddenly.
What about the Teapot Dome scandal?
Yes, that was, I suppose, the first great scandal that I was aware of.
And you covered the hearings.
I covered the hearings, yes.
And the Teapot Dome
the Teapot Dome, yes.
Woodrow Wilson, while still president, had set aside several parcels of land as naval oil reserves. One such location was an area of some 9,841 acres in Wyoming, known as the Teapot Dome oil leases. During the early years of his administration, Harding had turned over the administrating of that land to his Secretary of the Interior, Albert Bacon Fall. As early as 1922, the rumor had spread that Fall had secretly leased the government property to oil tycoon Harry Sinclair without putting it on the block for competitive bidding. Failed inquiries by the Senate had gone unanswered. Senator Burton K. Wheeler of Montana headed a congressional subcommittee that unearthed the startling evidence that Fall had indeed awarded the lease to Sinclair's Oil Company on April 7, 1922, and that later, upon retiring from the cabinet, the Secretary of the Interior had received an interest-free loan of $25,000 from Sinclair. At the same time, Fall awarded another set of government oil leases in California to oil magnate Edward L. Doheny. This time, Albert Fall was the recipient of a personal loan of $100,000. The federal government brought charges of conspiracy to defraud against Fall and Doheny in 1926. Legal technicalities snarled the case hopelessly, and both men were acquitted of the charges. Still, the following year, the Supreme Court declared both oil leases invalid and the land returned to the government.
Fall came in. At first he came in, he was proud and faced down the crowd, and then after about 4 or 5 months he came in, he was a broken man, and he shambled in, and everything had been exposed at that time.
In that same room where you covered the Teapot Dome scandal, you also covered the hearings on Watergate.
50 years later, and of course the 50 years before Teapot Dome, there have been the great scandals in the administration of Grant. And if you go back and look through the calendar, every 50 years has been a great scandal. There was the scandal of Grant, and there was the Teapot Dome, and then Mr. Nixon.
This led you to calculate what you call Strout's Law.
I promulgated Strout's Law that every 50 years we have a scandal, and watch out for 2023.
What was the difference between the Teapot Dome scandal, which magnetized the country's interest, and the Watergate scandal 50 years later?
Well, the stakes had changed. It was part of the growing sophistication of America. When I came to Washington, people were reaching for wealth. In Nixon's day, they weren't reaching for wealth. They may have had wealth on the side, but they were reaching for power.
You've been around under 12 presidents, I believe. Which was the best at handling the press?
Oh, without doubt, Franklin Roosevelt was. Oh, it was a delight to cover him. That was a spontaneous on both sides. We'd ask questions, and we'd ask follow-up questions. It's the follow-up questions that really that get the answers.
Describe one to me. Do you remember any particular press conference?
Well, I always think of the one that, one particular one, we were around that desk. The desk was covered with mascots and little toy elephants and toy donkeys and so forth. And there was this big smiling benevolent man leaning back in his chair and with his cigarette and throwing his head back and a big chin, and somebody would come in and he'd say, "What's the news today?" And somebody would shout out, I think it would be Fred Storm would shout out, "We came here to find out what the news is." And Roosevelt would say, I remember on one occasion, "Fred, you're just too big. There are 3 people behind you trying to see me. Somebody bring a chair up." Somebody brought a chair up. "Fred, you sit there, and from now on you sit in that chair." And Fred Storm sat in that chair, and you could hear the voices behind saying, "That's fine, that's fine. The United Press is having 2 big men. They shouldn't have such large figures."
Did Roosevelt really enjoy the press conference?
Oh, yes. Yes, he enjoyed them. And the greatest scene that I have ever seen at a press conference was right after Pearl Harbor. And that ended a chapter in American history. Every reporter in town could always remember for years afterward just exactly where he was when the news on Pearl Harbor came. So what does any journalist do in a thing like that? I went straight to the White House. And first we had various press conferences in the White House, and then late that night I was on the, I stayed there, and I and a group of 10 or 12 other reporters went over to the portico of the White House, and the stage settings were all there. There was not a moon that looked as though There was a piece of cheese and parts had been bitten out of it, and it climbed up through the elm trees there, and it was cold and crisp, and the crowd gathered behind the iron railing down below. As I say, we were on the portico, and at one point somebody in the crowd tried to start the Star-Spangled Banner. And he couldn't sing it. Nobody can sing the Star-Spangled Banner, and others. And I wrote at the time, it made me cry.
Listening to that crowd.
Listening to that crowd, yeah.
What about
it was a very moving experience. A week later, who should appear at the press conference but Winston Churchill? And that was the great moment when you had Franklin Roosevelt seating there, and Churchill, the other great leader of the English-speaking world, there with him. And we must have had about 200 people in the room, just back to back. And we shouted out, "We can't see you! We can't see you!" I think we may have said Winnie. I don't know what we said. "We can't see you." So he got up on a chair, and
Churchill did?
Churchill did, in front of the desk, with Roosevelt waving applause, not saying anything, but waving to him and encouraging him. And there was this man, not particularly formidable, rather dumpy, with a cherubic face. And I'm sure a lot of others just instantly had that feeling, can this be the man? Can this be the man who is leading the world? And then he began to talk, and he used this one word, Nazis, the Nazis. And he got more vituperation into that one word than I have ever heard. His jaw came out, and it went down onto his chest, and there was Winston Churchill.
What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget? Prodigious hammer strokes have been needed to bring us together today. If you will allow me to use other language, I will say that he must indeed have a blind soul who cannot see that some great purpose and design is being worked out here below, of which we have the honor to be the faithful servants. It is not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future, till I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come, the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace.
He stayed at the White House, I think, for about 8 days. He and Franklin Roosevelt got on a first-name basis. They'd go to the map room together. Churchill would push Roosevelt to the map room in his wheelchair and so forth.
You've seen a lot of crowds in your years of covering Washington. There's a marvelous passage from your book where you say, "The crowd was out there too when they brought Jack Kennedy's body back. That crowd haunts the place. It always appears. It was out there when President Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. It is an actor in the drama. When it materialized, silent, steady, patient, watching all night, you know great moments of history are occurring." What are some of the crowds you recall?
The most spectacular was when Franklin Roosevelt died, and I remember still the picture of the cortege coming down Pennsylvania Avenue, and there was somebody had been playing in the band. He was a black, and he dropped his whatever he was playing and just wept. And we all had that feeling.
What's the most significant change in press conferences over the years, from the first one you attended under Harding to the most recent under Reagan?
Well, you people have changed our press conferences. You're responsible for it. It's the coming of television. You had in the old days, let's see now, if I go back, it takes quite a while. Harding had only, he miscued and he gave some answer he shouldn't, so he would accept only written questions. Hoover came in. Hoover was Secretary of Commerce, and this television began to come in. I went down with Secretary Hoover and put on a demonstration of this new thing, television. It was the size of a playing card. I asked him to sign the program for me.
Herbert Hoover, April 7th,
1927.
1927.
And there's the New York Times, far-off speakers seen as well as heard here in a test of television. And you notice halfway down the bank it says, commercial use in doubt. There it is, commercial use in doubt.
Did he make any comment about this, the potential of this newfangled device?
Yes, he said he hoped it would never be used to commercial use that would injure the public. He didn't want it to be commercialized.
President Eisenhower was the first to open the press conference to television, even though it couldn't be live. Do you remember in 1954 when that happened?
Yeah, sure. Jim Haggerty would decide which tapes could go out, and he would pick assorted tapes that showed the president in a favorable light, and he'd put those out. And then later on, of course, it got to be more and more.
I'm very happy that Dick Nixon's my friend. I'm very happy to have him as an associate in government. I would be happy to be on any political ticket in which I was a candidate with him. Now, if those words aren't plain, then it's merely because people can't understand the plain, unvarnished truth. I have nothing further to add to it.
Congressman Alger of Texas today criticized Mr. Salinger as a, quote, young and inexperienced White House publicity man, end quote. And questioned the advisability of having him visit the Soviet Union. I wonder if you have any comments.
I know there are always some people who feel that Americans are always young and inexperienced and foreigners are always able and tough and great negotiators, but I don't think that the United States acquired its present position of leadership in the free world if that view were correct. Now, he also, as I saw the press, said that Mr. Salinger's main job was to increase my standing in the Gallup poll. Having done that, he's now moving on to... Check.
President, could you tell us anything about the public reaction as reflected in telegrams and letters to you to your decision to bomb the Hanoi high-vol oil?
Yes, we have, first of all the communist countries, generally speaking, opposed it rather vehemently. Some of them were rather vicious in their statements that we were, and I think inaccurate, that we were bombing civilian targets and killing civilians. We were very careful to select military targets that were not in the center of the area and to spare all civilians, and we took every precaution available to us. I cannot understand the thinking of any country or any people or any person that say that we should sit by with our hands tied behind us while these men bring their mortars and their hand grenades and their bombs into our barracks and kill our Marines and attack our camps and murder the village chief, and that we should not do anything about it.
Sir, last week in your speech you referred to those who would exploit Watergate to keep you from doing your job. Could you specifically detail who those are?
I would suggest that where the shoe fits, people should wear it. I would think that some political figures, some members of the press, perhaps, some members of the television, perhaps would exploit it. I don't impute, interestingly enough, motives, however, that are improper interest. Because here's what is involved. There are a great number of people in this country that would prefer that I do resign. There are a great number of people in this country that didn't accept the mandate of 1972. After all, I know that most of the members of the press corps were not enthusiastic, and I understand that, about either my election in 68 or 72. That's not unusual. Frankly, if I had always followed what the press predicted or the polls predicted, I would have never been elected president.
Mr. President, when you say that Senator Kennedy that his statements have not been accurate, responsible, and that they've not helped our country, and when he and his aides say that your own campaign has been misleading and negative and taking cheap shots, how can that do anything but further and bitterly divide the Democrats? And aren't you both helping the Republicans in the general election?
Well, I might point out to you that I'm an incumbent Democratic president. I didn't ask for a challenger, but have no aversion to a campaign. I want the world to know that I am not going to resume business as usual as a partisan campaigner out on the campaign trail until our hostages are back here, free and at home.
You have a report before you that was given to you from the Justice Department. It shows the discriminations that actually exist on the books in federal agencies and departments against women. Now, you're committed to take care of legal equity for women, and this report has not been made public. Would you please let us see it, and would you do something about it?
Hasn't reached me yet, but...
It came to you in the cabinet meeting, and you admitted at your last press conference that you had it, and I have checked this out thoroughly. It came from... Yes, sir. It came from Assistant Secretary...
There is a task force that is working on this very question.
You've got it. You've got part of it. You've got the first quart of it. It was given to you at the cabinet meeting by Brad Reynolds. And it says there's been a lot of sexist harassment of women.
Harassment?
I suggest that you look into that. He talked about it at the cabinet meeting. You were there.
Now, Sarah, just a minute here with the discussioner. We'll be getting an R rating.
You go to a press conference to get news, yes, but you go also to see how the president is handling himself. You go to see whether he looks, whether he's pale, whether he looks sick, whether he looks well, whether he's onto his job. You're estimating the man. So that you can have a press conference which doesn't say an awful lot. In one way, that's an invidious thing, and it's funny, but you go to a press conference for other reasons than just to get spot news. I have to say a word about Hoover, too. I thought Hoover was going to be our greatest president, so you can see that my judgment wasn't very good. I used to go to his press conferences. He'd sit at the end of a long table, and he was a shy man. He had trouble in meeting your eye. He wouldn't look directly at you. And we'd ask these questions, and he'd say another question, and we'd have 5 or 6 questions, and then at the end, he'd raise his head. He would have had all those 5 or 6 questions codified, and he'd answer them. He'd give a superb answer to it, and I thought, this is the man who's going to bring order to American government.
What happened?
Oh, he was the victim of a Greek tragedy. He was overcome by forces which he didn't understand at all. He was a good man who, he was slain by the monster of the economic cycle killed him.
I reread some of your columns in 1977 that said, 50 years ago, a vacationing president rode down a mountain to a semi-weekly press conference and created a political mystery that has lasted to this day. What mystery?
Well, that was Calvin Coolidge, and that's another story that's fascinating and has never been solved and never will be solved because the people are all dead, the speculation on it. I always enjoyed Coolidge. Everybody enjoyed him. There was a curious side to him. He had received, as every president does, a hamper with a turkey in it at Thanksgiving Day. And he actually did this. He took the White House cat and he put it into the hamper with the turkey to see what would happen. I don't know what happened. And then one time there was an alarm from the White House, and the guards came rushing from all over the White House. The alarm had sounded. And little willful man had pressed all the alarm buttons and then got behind a curtain to see what would happen. And there he was.
The
Coolidge,
president?
yeah, the Coolidge had done this.
Coolidge told reporters that when many people are out of work, unemployment results. Was Calvin Coolidge a dummy?
No, I don't think so. He was a sharp Yankee with unimaginative. He did more sleeping than anybody who's ever been in the White House before. He took a nap every afternoon. And that was just the kind of a president that the country wanted. They wanted a president who slept. The country was rolling along. They'd started on the great development, the great boom, the Coolidge boom, the Hoover boom, and he did. I thought he was pretty bright. But he had tragedy in the White House. His beloved son got an infection in his foot playing tennis and died. It was before they knew what to do, and died, blood poisoning.
Was he ever the same after that, the president?
No, he had gone up to his hideaway up in the mountains out west, and Grace, his wife, who was the nicest woman in the world, had got lost. She was guarded by a handsome Secret Service man, and they waited lunch for her and waited lunch for her. And there was nothing evil in the thing at all, but there was talk about it, and it got into some of the Boston papers.
Her relationship with him?
Not just the mere fact that she had been late, and there was this good-looking Secret Service man who was guarding her and was lost too. That was all there was to it. And the Secret Service man was dismissed, or not dismissed, he was given another assignment. I have a private speculation about it. What happened about when he said he went up to the mountain and he wrote out, I think it was 12 copies of this statement that he was going to make. He came down the mountain, he passed them out to the press there.
I do not choose.
I do not choose to run. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't submit himself to any questions. And he went back up the mountain again, and he had been accompanied by a senator. The senator told Grace about it, and she said, "How like Cal that is." He just, he didn't mention it. He kept it hugged to his breast.
He didn't even tell his wife.
He didn't tell his wife. He didn't tell anybody. And I've always, I've always thought it was an act of contrition to his wife.
You've watched a lot of presidents, but you've also watched a lot of other notable people in this city, including some towering figures in the Congress. If you had to pick one or two of the supreme congressional leaders of your century, whom would you pick?
Well, as a speaker, eloquence, I'd put Bora first.
Of Idaho.
Bora of Idaho. Goodness, you have to say that, do you now? Yes, Bora, William E. Bora. William E. Watt Bora. And, well, I can tell you that. In the press gallery in the Senate, we all sit outside the folding glass doors and wait for something to happen, and then we may go in and look and see what the boys are doing, the senators on the floor. But when Bora spoke, the Secretary of the Senate would open the doors and he'd shout two words, "Bora's up." And the whole crowd, 50 or 100 reporters, would all go for those doors and sit down. Bora's up.
It is often said in recent years that the Constitution of the United States is not a sacred document, but I feel that an instrument of government purchased by years of sacrifice and bloodshed upon the field, by weeks and months of arduous effort in council, which has held together people of all climes, races, and faiths in ordered liberty, which gives freedom to all who come within its jurisdiction, which makes the people sovereign and their officials their agents, is sacred by every rule which measures the worth of human progress or human freedom.
Bore us up. And there's never been a senator in my lifetime of whom it could be said, bore us up, applied to him, who could really be eloquent.
What about LBJ as a congressional leader?
Lyndon Johnson was one person who carried his personality with him very effectively. I interviewed him one time when he was in the Senate at that time. He was majority leader in this huge Sistine Chapel sort of a office that they gave him with nymphs overhead, diaphanous nymphs, you know. You've seen
Room
that,
P38.
see that on the,
Room P38 in the Senate, yes.
And I'd met him before, but I had no reason to be there. I had asked some question, and he invited me in. And he kept a whole string of important people waiting because he was trying to convince me of something that I didn't care very much about one way or the other, and he just happened to use the metaphor, I'm not a babe in arms, and he sprang out from behind that big desk as though he were ejected from a catapult, and he went marching up and down this with a babe in arms. I heard him deliver that magnificent speech on civil rights before a joint session of Congress, and I found in my notes when I was up in the press gallery that I had interrupted myself to say I shall always remember this speech.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
You remember this Washington that I came to was almost a segregated city. In 1922, a black couldn't get served in a restaurant. If he went to a national theater, he couldn't buy a seat under the second balcony. And just in our lifetime, this whole change has occurred.
What about Nixon's Republican cloth coat speech? Do you remember that? That was a very effective speech.
Well, there were two political speeches in my lifetime. I would put that as one of them. Yes, that was the cloth coat. That was the Checkers speech. They discovered that there was a fund to be used at his discretion for political purposes, and some people called it a slush fund. That was unfair to him. It wasn't a slush fund, and he made a reply on television which was corny and meretricious, but it was magnificent. And he told about how simple he was, and he brought his wife in and his children in and his little dog in, and his wife didn't have a fur coat the way some people did. She had a Republican cloth coat.
I should say this, that Pat doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have a respectable Republican cloth coat. And I always tell her that she'd look good in anything. One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too. We did get something, a gift, after the election. A man down in Texas heard Pat on the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checkers. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep him.
Do you remember what Eisenhower said to Nixon after that cloth coat speech?
You're my boy.
Come before
It kept him on the ticket.
That's right. And the other speech that I will never forget, I have almost total recall on, was the speech Franklin Roosevelt gave. That was the little dog Fowler speech. And he said that we've just come back from Alaska, the dog was along, and I'm used to having things said about myself, I take that for granted, my children and my wife, but now they've attacked my little dog Fowler.
Well, of course, I don't resent attacks, and my family don't resent attacks, but Fowler does resent attacks. You know, Fowler's Scotch. And being a Scotty, as soon as he learned that the Republican fiction writers in Congress and out had concocted a story that I'd left him behind on an Aleutian island and had sent a destroyer back to find him at a cost to the taxpayers of $2 or $3 or $8 or $20 million, his Scotch soul was furious. He has not been the same dog since.
He just milked that joke, and the audience was receptive, and they were rolling in the aisles. It was the only time when I could really say they were rolling in the aisles.
Let's talk about some of what you referred to in the past as your happiest recollections. One was traveling with Harry Truman on his famous 1948 whistle-stop campaign across America, and you called him Gallant Harry. Why was that?
That was in 1948 when he was obviously defeated. He couldn't win. He was just helpless there. I think there were 50 reporters on that special train, and Newsweek took a poll, and every one of us, including we said he's going to be defeated. We all knew he was going to be defeated. And, but he didn't know it. And we'd ask each other, has anybody told him he can't win? And he'd do these horrible things, too. But he was so game through it. One time they got him in the, what was that name of that hall? The Arkansas Ben Hall. It was the name of Arkansas, Kansas, and Nebraska. And there was a Legion parade, and the Legion were all out parading, and when he got into the hall, they had only about 1,000 people right down the front seat.
This was for the President of the United
This was
States?
for the President of the United States. They were out parading, and they were on the town. And so there was that awful moment. We went in there, and we gasped, and we said the President had only been able to turn out about 2,000 in a hall that holds about 10,000. And then came that awful moment when you television people took your machines, and you could see the light, and they moved it slowly around the hall, up and down these empty seats. And there was this game little guy. He had to live through that.
An empty hall?
Empty hall.
Virtually.
And he did it. He went out and dedicated Charlie Ross got his signals mixed. And
His press secretary.
His press secretary. And he dedicated a landing field to, he thought he was going to dedicate it to a war hero, and it was a woman, it wasn't a war hero. It was just some
all
local
kind of mistakes
celebrity. Yeah, just awful things like that happened to him all the time.
And yet he never gave up, did he? He never quit.
He never gave up, and he always insisted that he was going to win. And
you said he got wonderfully corny the further west he got.
he was just professionally corny. Yes, he was beyond belief corny. He said, I'm going down to Berkeley to get me a degree. And he brought in his grandfather, who had been a covered wagon rider, and he kept bringing the grandfather in. And then some little scandal was supposed to have been exposed during his absence, and it didn't amount to anything. And his reply to that was, "They can't prove nothing, they ain't got a thing on me." And my dear friend Tom Stokes put those two lines together, and oh, Susanna, I'm going down to Berkeley to get me a degree. They can't prove nothing, they ain't got a thing on me. And we all sang. There's always a song that grows out of any one of these trips. So there used to be in those days.
You remember election night, 1948?
Oh, yes, surely, you bring it back to me. I remember it very poignantly because I write for the Christian Science Monitor, and I also write for the New Republic, and I had to have my column in the New Republic ahead of time. So I had Dewey all elected in print. And then, by golly, Truman deceived me. And I had these mingled emotions. I was going to be mortified, as everybody else, all these other reporters were, the Alsops and everybody else. We all had, what kind of a president will Dewey made. And yet I had the rejoicing that the game little fellow had won.
I've sent the following wire to President Truman. My heartiest congratulations to you on your election and every good wish for a successful administration. I urge all Americans to unite behind you in support of every effort to keep our nation strong and free and to establish peace in the world.
And Mr. Keltenborn was saying, while the president is a million votes ahead in the popular vote, we have yet to hear. Very sure that when the country vote comes in, Mr. Truman will be defeated by an overwhelming majority. And I went back to bed and went to sleep.
There's a wonderful paragraph in one of your columns. It said, "No political writer who sat through the astonishing returns last week will ever forget them. There was personal humiliation for us as a prophet, but a glowing and wonderful sense that the American people couldn't be ticketed by polls, knew its own mind, and had picked the rather unlikely but courageous figure of Truman to carry on its banner."
It's very true, yes. I have just the same feelings now. It was showed that despite all the machinery and mechanical part of the election, the American nation is there and breaks through at the appropriate time.
The other happiest recollection I've heard you talk about was traveling with Nikita Khrushchev, of all people, in 1959.
Well, that was unbelievable. We went right across the United States with this little roly-poly figure who was alien in every way and looks and so forth, and was agreeable and affable and having a wonderful time. And we got out to San Francisco, and they took us into a supermarket. They wanted to show Nikita Khrushchev what real America was like, so they took us into a supermarket, and we wrecked the market. We just wrecked it. And to understand that, you have to realize that when a celebrity like Nikita Khrushchev or the president travels, about 1,000 to 1,500 people travel with him. We had the photographers of all the French and German newspapers, and these European photographers, they are a breed by themselves. They stop at nothing. And we got into this great supermarket where there was a crowd of people, and we barged in on that thing and flashing away. And there in the center of the worst thicket would always be little Khrushchev, who was about, I guess he was about a little over 5 feet tall. I got up onto the checkout counter. I thought that was the safest place for me. I climbed up on top of it. And right down below me, there was a recumbent figure of a woman on the floor. And there she was, people trampling around, not stepping on her, but there she was on the floor. I asked one of the photographers later, "Did you see that woman who fainted, was right there on the floor?" He said, "Fainted? I thought she was dead." And then over on one side of this huge supermarket, a fight had broken out, a fist fight. And I don't know, there things were going on all around, and I asked the fellow, we asked them all at the end what had been going on, and I asked, what were you fighting with the butcher for? And he said, I don't know, he attacked me. But you were over there at the meat counter. Why would he attack you? I don't know, I didn't do anything. I was standing on his meat.
Well, those were some trips, weren't they? I mean, you've seen it from the ground up as well as from the Senate gallery.
That's right, yes.
There's another episode in your life you write very movingly about, and that's watching the invasion of Normandy in 1944.
D-Day, yes, that was out of the normal track of the Washington Reporter, and I was aligned to the USS Quincy, one of the most magnificent cruisers in the world, and I was the only reporter on board, and the captain took me up to the forward lookout, and there I was to watch the Battle of D-Day. He provided a stenographer for me who was to stand right beside me, and I was to dictate to him as it went along, but I found I couldn't dictate, so I typed the story out. I typed it out on a typewriter that spoke French. It had all the French, and every time they let go a salvo of our guns, something would fall off the walls, a shaving brush or a bolt or something, and it came around, the whole boat would quiver. That evening, we didn't know who'd won the battle. Our hearts were in our mouths. And then over from England came a line of airplanes. Every airplane had a glider behind it. It was towing. We could see the airplane and along a little wafer, a Zephyr, and then a glider. And it just came from England. It didn't stop coming. They kept coming, more and more of them. By the time they had reached, done whatever they had done, the airplanes began coming back again, but without the gliders. The gliders had been let off, and they had landed on Normandy, and they were behind the lines. And I still have a feeling of, there's no other word to use than religious. I had a religious feeling of prayer. This was it lifted me out of myself. We can phrase it in any way we want, but there it was. This was America. We had done this.
We reporters can never truly, finally separate our own feelings. We can never really be objective, can we?
No, of course not. We shouldn't be. No. But we should keep it under restraint.
You once wrote that this has been an extraordinarily fascinating half-century from Teapot Dome to Watergate. It was marked, you said, by America's coming of age. What do you mean, coming of age?
Well, there was this innocence that we had when I came to Washington in every way. You go back, the streetcars and no television and
no airplanes like those coming over here.
No airplanes overhead, and we couldn't lose a war. It was impossible for the United States. We'd never lost a war. So we must be superior to anybody else. That was before Vietnam. And things have constantly got more complicated, and things are speeded up, and the tempo is faster. The dangers are vastly greater than they were. I think we've been united, and I think we have to say that we have to put in a word of praise for the American nation, democracy. We believe in democracy. And we believe in live and let live. We've got better. When I came to Washington, the World Almanac every year at the end would have a horrible list of lynchings that had occurred in the United States during the past year. And there'd be 60 or 70 or 80. Well, the World Almanac doesn't carry any account of the number of lynchings in the United States. You can say anything you want about how civil rights have a long way to go in this country, but compared to what they used to be, we have for a civilized nation, we have a magnificent achievement. We've done pretty well.
Have you enjoyed this show?
Enjoyed it? Yes, of course. And it's never-ending variety. You always think you've seen everything, and then you've got something brand new that hasn't ever happened before. It happens every day. You get a new kind of president. You get a new set of questions that are asked him. You get a new challenge to him. You get a new international problem.
So it's quite a spectacle from 1922.
Oh, it's the greatest
forward.
show on earth.
This has been a look at Presidents and Politics with Richard Strout. I'm Bill Moyers.
This program has been brought to you by the people of Chevron, who have been helping to supply America's energy needs throughout the 20th century.